Another edition of the interview on Africa 24. Thank you for joining us. Our guest for today is Mr. Solomon Quaynor. He is currently the Vice President for Private Sector, Infrastructure and Industrialization at the African Development Bank, where he started in May 2020. Mr. Solomon Quaynor, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Africa 24 TV studio.
Thank you very much, Ruth.
So can you tell us the role of the private sector for which you are responsible in the African Development Bank's overall strategy?
So, Ruth, when we take a look at, the economy in Africa and we look at jobs creation, 70% of GDP is contributed by the private sector. 70% of jobs are created by the private sector. And so, in the development world, working on the private sector is extremely important. Now, we at the African Development Bank both work with the public sector, but also work with the private sector. And we're increasingly going to do more in terms of what we do in the private sector, because to achieve our global, public goods of effecting climate change, while still achieving our development objectives so that we meet the SDGs and Agenda 2063 of the African Union, we're going to really rely on the private sector. So we at AfDB are ramping up the work we do in the private sector, and we're doing it really through 5 different strategic priorities. Light up and power Africa. So we're looking to actually, through the private sector, increase renewable contribution to the energy needs, and also in getting better access, to energy for the multitudes of people in Africa. We're also looking to feed Africa. So this is where we're going to be doing a lot of financing through the private sector in terms of agro-processing, and implementing our flagship specialized agro-processing zones. We're also going to focus on industrializing Africa. And this is where there are, various verticals that we're going to focus on, which include, cotton to textiles to garments, which includes the critical mineral beneficiation for the battery, electric vehicle and battery value chain, which also includes the pharmaceutical sector. We're also going to use private sector to integrate Africa as well to achieve the objectives of the African Continental Free Trade Area. So private sector is really central to what we do across all our strategic priorities.
Infrastructure remains one of Africa's most pressing development needs. In this respect, there are many disparities between countries. And by the way, the African Development Bank Group has been contributing to a number of projects for many years. But due to urgent needs arising from the international economic situation, there have been many challenges. So what can be done for the least developed countries?
No, so we at the African Development Bank, we do have the African Development Bank, and we also have the African Development Fund. The African Development Fund is really how we work with the least developed countries, and it's really through primarily grant resources. And we use this to achieve the development plans of the least developed countries. But one of the things that we're really doing differently at the African Development Bank is really integrating the least developed countries also to the larger markets. And that's why integrating Africa is a priority for us. And a good example of, what we've discussed at the Africa Investment Forum is really, this concept of regional corridors, where we connect landlocked countries or land-linked countries, which includes a lot of least developed countries, with the bigger markets at the coast, with the ports, etc. So taking a look at regional economies is one of the ways in which, and implementing the objectives of the African Continental Free Trade Area is where we actually look at, we look at countries in Africa from a regional perspective, and that way we're able to do a whole lot more in terms of the least developed countries. But, through the African Development Fund, we're able to actually provide resources to the least developed countries, for infrastructure, for their national development strategies, etc. And we plan to actually scale that up, including through the private sector.
In your opinion, what role does public-private partnership play in driving economic growth and achieving the sustainable development goals of Africa?
So Public resources have become scarce, especially as a result of COVID. Fiscal resources in most of our countries are quite limited. And so this is where we advocate public-private partnerships so we can leverage the limited resources that governments have and still continue, for example, with their infrastructure development plans. Continue with, implementing, their strategic objectives, for example, around feeding Africa, et cetera. So, public-private partnerships or PPPs is simply a way of leveraging the private sector for what would typically be goods and services provided by the public sector. And that way we can continue to accelerate economic development even when governments have limited fiscal resources.
So, what are the long-term goals of the African Development Bank Group for this sector?
Is actually not a sector because it applies to different sectors. You can do public-private partnerships in energy. You can do it in transport infrastructure. You can do it in hospitals and healthcare. So it's really a mechanism to implement, various development plans with countries across Africa. Both the big countries, the least developed countries, having shocks to their fiscal resources, we believe that public-private partnerships are going to be a key way in which they implement their development plans, going forward. And so, we are also spending time to, deepen the capacity of governments to implement PPPs, because this is a very efficient way of combining public and private to really deliver on the SDGs, to deliver on Agenda 2063, and also to deliver really on our strategic high five priorities as the African Development Bank.
Mr. Solomon Quaynor, Vice President for Private Sector, Infrastructure and Industrialization at the African Development Bank Group. Thank you for honoring our invitation.
Thank you very much, Ruth.
Thank you, viewers, for watching this interview. Stay tuned for more programs on Africa 24.